Datuk-Datuk, professors, fellows and academicians of the Academy of Science Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Discourse on Climate Change 2022, Risk, Adaptation and Mitigation, Implications and Way Forward. I am Nurfasharina Muhammad of University Kebangsaan Malaysia's Southeast Asia Disaster Prevention Research Initiative, better known as CPUKM. The event will be moderated by Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, chairperson and founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, which is the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative. Datin Sri Sunita is a lawyer by training and qualified as a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. She is also a fellow of the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, promotes gender diversity on boards with the 30% Club, and a member of the advisory panel of the United Nations Global Compact Malaysia's Sustainability Center of Excellence. Her main passion is to increase sustainability and climate resilience in the corporate sector. I now invite Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar to moderate the event.
Thank you, Dr. Fasha. Yang berbahagia Tan Sri Datuk-Datuk, professors, fellows, and academicians of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to the discourse today on Climate Change 2022. This event is jointly convened by the Committee on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, Climate Governance Malaysia, the Asian Network on Climate Science and Technology, ANGS, and CIPRI, UKM. The aim of this event today is to mobilize scientific leadership and partnerships for climate resilient development. Ladies and gentlemen, the science of climate change is always advancing and becoming much more robust. It is important that our local scientists, corporate leaders, and policymakers are abreast of the latest findings. This will enable us to recalibrate our policies and take much more effective action. The event will start with the presentation of the most recent key findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports, which were released earlier this year by 3 IPCC authors from Malaysia. The presentation session will be followed by brief comments from a panel of thought leaders from the Academy of Sciences. These panelists have been invited to share their views on the implications and issues of priority for the country, as well as the way forward. We also invite all participants to share your views, please, in the Q&A panel or in the chat box. And as all of your inputs will be documented, it will serve as a basis for ASM to mobilize scientific leadership and partnerships for climate resilient development. I will now take a moment to introduce our speakers for today's event. If you could kindly switch on your camera when you're being introduced, Prof.Joy, Jacqueline Pereira, is a Principal Research Fellow at CIPRI UKM and a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, where she chairs the Committee on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction. Professor Pereira is also Vice Chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and an author of the Summary for Policymakers for the Working Group 2 report. Next, we have Dr. Zelina Zaiton Ibrahim. Associate Professor Dr. Zelina Zaiton Ibrahim is an academic at the Faculty of Forestry and Environment at University Putra, Malaysia. She is the IPCC Work Group 2 coordinating lead author for Chapter 16 on key risks across sectors and region. Dr. Zelina is also an author of the Summary for Policymakers for the Working Group 2 report. And finally, but certainly not least, Dr. Sharina Abdul Halim, Deputy Director of the Institute for Environment and Development at Seri of University Kebangsaan Malaysia. She is the IPCC Work Group 2 lead author for Chapter 10 on Asia. And prior to this, Dr. Sharina was also a lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, published in 2018. So Professor Pereira will first briefly introduce us to the IPCC and the 6th assessment cycle, and then Dr. Zelina will then present some global findings on warming projections, observed impacts, future risks, adaptation, feasibility, and introduce the concept of climate resilient development, which is now better defined in Work Group 2. Dr. Sharina will then spotlight some observed and projected impacts, key risks and adaptation measures, as well as enabling conditions of relevance to Asia. Prof. Pereira will then present some highlights for you to reflect and for you to share your views. I encourage all participants to type your views in the Q&A panel throughout the sessions. So now over to you, Prof. Pereira.
Thank you very much, Datin Sri Sunita, from Madam Moderator. So good afternoon, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri, Datuk, Professors, Fellows and Academicians of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So it is a pleasure for me to be here today to share the findings of the IPCC on risk, adaptation and mitigation, and particularly to be here with two of my IPCC colleagues. Three of us were the Malaysian representatives in the Working Group 2 report. Yeah. Let me just start by sharing, giving you an introduction to the IPCC. The IPCC was actually established in 1988 jointly by the World Meteorology Organization and the UNEP. Thus far, they have actually produced 5 assessment reports, 14 special reports, 9 guidelines, and some 6 technical papers, which have been very influential. So in terms of the first assessment report released in 1990, that led to the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which then becomes the platform now for all governments to do their negotiation. The second assessment report was provided scientific inputs for the Kyoto Protocol and so on, and up to even the 5th assessment report, which provided input for the Paris Agreement, where you are now familiar with the 1.5 degrees and 2.5 degrees global warming levels. And most recently, the scientific input from Working Group 1 served as a negotiation input for COP26. And these 2 reports that will be presented today will be actually used in the next discussion in the UNFCCC. So going back to the 6th assessment cycle, so in this particular cycle, we had an unprecedented number of 6 reports. The first 3 special reports and the 3 working group reports, which drew on the scientific peer-reviewed literature. And we are now preparing the synthesis report, which is going to draw on the findings from all of these 6 reports, which will then serve as an input to the UNFCCC. So if you want to look at the report by numbers, in terms of Working Group 2 report, we had 270 authors from 67 countries, and the team of authors and contributing authors reviewed more than 34,000 scientific papers, giving us growing scientific knowledge and our best understanding yet. And each of these chapters that were produced, they had a total of 62,000 review comments, and each of these review comments had to be addressed. And my 2 colleagues here, they would have addressed between them 2,000 comments each. So the IPCC is not a place for those who are afraid of hard work. So with that, I have the pleasure of passing this on to my colleague, Dr. Zelina Zaiton Ibrahim from University Putra, Malaysia, who was the IPCC Working Group 2 coordinating lead author. Over to you, Dr. Zelina.
Thank you, Prof.Joy. Ladies and gentlemen, the Working Group 2 6 assessment report, together with the Working Group 1 report, indicates that the scientific evidence is unequivocal about climate change. It is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. In this presentation, I will just take you through very briefly, as Prof.Joy mentioned, the report, it's very comprehensive. And just to show you what our future warming projections are, let me just show you in the next slide, the warming projections from the Working Group 1 report. This shows the physical basis of climate change. And you will see in this table at the top, across the top, you will see the timescale, near term, 2020, 2040, and then midterm 2040, 2060, and long term 2080 to the end of the century. For the near term, in the next 20 years, we anticipate that the warming levels will reach 1.5 for all of the scenarios modeled. And you will see that there are various scenarios. The top scenario is the most pessimistic scenario, where a lot of adaptation and mitigation is occurring. And the bottom scenario, you will see written as SSP 5, 8.5, is indicating very high emissions of greenhouse gases. And if we progress and look at the last column on the right-hand side at the long term, the most optimistic scenario, the most optimistic scenario at SSP1 at the top, 1.9, which is the only scenario which meets the Paris Agreement and requires net zero to be achieved around 2050. The best estimate is a warming temperature of 1.4 above pre-industrial or the beginning of this century, while the worst estimation is a 4.4 degrees addition compared to the pre-industrial. So based on the assessments of temperature and warming levels, Working Group 2 then assess what would be the observed impacts. And in the next slide, we see the concept for the interaction between hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And we indicate that if you see on the right-hand side, this is an assessment made to ecosystems as well as to impacts to water at the bottom, impacts to health. This is just a glance for you to see. The important message to take home is that the impacts arising from the warming, which is the hazards, increased precipitation, for example, drought events, they are dependent, the impacts on us are dependent on the vulnerability and exposure of each of the different communities. And of course, it also depends on the level of adaptation that we are taking in order to manage the hazards. But we find, and this is increased in this working group report, that multiple simultaneous as well as sequential extreme events, and we have experienced some of them in Malaysia recently, these will result in compound, complex, and complication of risks, and which will cascade across sectors and boundaries. I will show an example later on. In the next slide, we see what is the assessment of future risk, and the future risk has been assessed overall for the global level. We see on the left-hand side the projection of warming levels depending on the model scenarios. So the most optimistic is at the bottom. You will see the light blue color, whereas the most pessimistic is at the top, a purple color. The vertical scale is the warming level. As you saw in the table I introduced earlier, the near term, the midterm, and the end of the century temperature values are demonstrated here. And on the right-hand side is an assessment of risk faced by 5 different components. The first is unique and threatened systems, RFC1. The second is extreme weather events, RFC2. RFC3 is distribution of impacts, the disproportion of impacts to people around the globe, which affects the vulnerability and exposure. And RFC4 is the global aggregate impacts, including economic impacts, where Whereas the last one, RFC5, is a large-scale single events, which means, let's say, large melts of the ice caps and ice sheets, changes in the oceanic circulation. We see by the colors, purple indicating very high risk, red high, and yellow moderate. And if you look at the grade line, which is about and near the bottom, which indicates present warming levels, we are at the moment at roughly 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. We are already at very high risk for RFC1 ecosystems, unique and threatened ecosystems, and we will very soon reach very high if the warming level goes up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So RFC1 and RFC2 are the ones which are of most concern in the near to midterm. Whereas for the RFC, the rest of the RFCs, if warming continues, we will start to reach high to very high levels of risk. Assessment is also done in the next slide to risk to natural and human systems. Natural systems are at the top, indicating terrestrial and oceanic systems, whereas at the bottom, assessment is being done for health systems. And you can see here, there is some assessment of heat stress, water scarcity, ecosystem species loss, biodiversity loss. Assessment has also been done for some regional key risks in the next slide. And the policy relevance for Malaysia is that if you look at the list of diagrams being presented, we don't have actually any diagrams for Asia. And this is because for certain regions, that is the small islands, Asia, Central and South America, authors were constrained by availability of literature, particularly downscale climate projections. And also there is uncertainty in the direction of change, whether it's negative or positive, as well as for many regions, let's say small islands for Asia, there's a great diversity of climatologies and the socioeconomic context. For Asia, for example, from Russia with polar ice caps, South Asia, Middle East to East Asia and Southeast Asia have very different socioeconomic trends as well as climatology from the equator up to the polar regions. So we had a great difficulties in making an overall regional assessment. However, if you see on the left-hand side, there is a box outline for Asia. There are a number of key risks which have been identified for the Asian continent, and Dr. Sharina will explain a bit more on this. However, it's important to note that just because we don't have diagrams for Asia, it doesn't mean that there are no risks. One of the findings from this report also in the next slide is that risks will compound and cascade. Here we have a diagram for impact of, let's say, heavy rainfall on industry, leading to impacts to the supply chain. And a very good example, which is also given within the report, is the floods in Thailand in 2011. Which resulted in a $40 billion economic loss to Thailand. Some 800 people also died in those floods, and that affected the trade balance between Thailand, Japan, Europe, as well as to the Americas. Now, we would need to do responses, adaptation and mitigation responses. The next slide shows some possible adaptation responses. This links to feasibility, whether it's possible for us to do or not. And you see on the top right-hand side of the columns, these analyses show the feasibility of assessment depending on the different factors. The factors include synergies with mitigation, economic, technological, institutional, social, environmental, and geophysical conditions. As I mentioned, also the adaptation responses can have synergies with mitigation. They also have co-benefits for sustainability. An assessment was done, shown in the next slide, with the SDGs. So if you see in the right-hand side column, a lot of pluses. These are the listing of SDGs from 1 to 17. A lot of adaptation responses could also assist in achieving the SDGs. However, there are limits to adaptation indicated in the next slide. And these limits are related to the warming level. And you can see here above 1.5, some of the natural adaptation solutions will no longer work. Fresh water is an issue. And by 2 degrees centigrade, it will be very challenging to farm multiple staple crops in many of the current growing areas. But a big adaptation constraint is financial constraints. And this is also being highlighted in the report because the current global financial flows are still insufficient, although promises have been made. And so we need to move towards a climate resilient development, and this is indicated in the next slide. And this is to avoid mounting losses. We need to look at our hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and use the co-benefits that can be achieved to moving towards a climate resilient development. There are many pathways as indicated in the next slide. We need to reduce climate risk through adaptation, societal choices that support the CRD are those that will integrate mitigation and adaptation together in system-wide changes. A whole of society approach is required. Some examples are given in the next slide for urban adaptation options for climate resilient development. There is a listing of different options which can be taken here, and as well in the following presentation by Dr. Sharina, you will see how some of these might apply for Asia. Thank you very much for listening to me. I now hand the platform to Dr. Sharina Abdul Halim, the IPCC Working Group 2 lead author for Chapter 10 on Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Zelina for the very kind introduction. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon and salam sejahtera. Yang berbahagia Tan Sri Datuk Professor, Fellows and Academicians of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, ladies and gentlemen. So here I have this huge responsibility to share with you, very humble, on the key findings on the climate change impacts and risk in Asia. Okay, so what we will see today is a glimpse of the Chapter 10 report. These are the key findings from the 172 pages. Trying to summarize to you today in about 12 minutes on the observed and the projected climate change impacts. As you know, Asia is a very populous continent, and in Asia now we are faced with unique set of challenges as a result of the differences in terms of our climatic zones. And therefore, currently, for the rising temperature that are increasing in terms of the likelihood of the threat of heat waves across Asia now, particularly droughts in arid and semi-arid areas of West Central and South Asia. Furthermore, floods in the monsoon region in South and Southeast, as well as the East Asia now, together with the glacier melting in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. These are all coming from the assessments report coming from various literature, and I would like to encourage you to refer for further details in the Chapter 10. So today there will be 7 aspects or sectors that will be discussed in terms of the observed, as well as the projected on these climate change impacts in Asia. The first one would be on water. As we know now that the Asian countries are experiencing a hotter summer climate, resulting in the increase of energy demand for cooling at a rapid rate. And together with the population growth, this decrease in the precipitation influences the energy demand as well, as desalination, underground water pumping, and other energy-intensive methods are now increasingly being used for water supplies. So by the mid-21st century, the international transboundary river basins of Amudaya Indo-Ganges could face these severe water scarcity challenges due to climatic variability and changes acting as stress multiplies. And we see that due to the global warming, more and more of our Asian countries now could experience increase of drought condition 5 to 20% by the end of this century. Okay, and the next one would be to look into the ecosystem. So our ecosystem, as reported in chapter 10, would be on the observed biodiversity or habitat loss of animals or plants that is linked to climate change in some parts of Asia. And this future climate change could cause biodiversity and habitat loss in many parts of Asia. By using the modeling approaches, we see that the future climate change will reduce the suitable habitat of protected plants, particularly in the coastal habitats of Asia now, which are diverse, and the impacts of climate change, including rising temperature, ocean acidification, and sea level rise, has now brought negative effects to the services and the livelihood of people depending on it. And we see the risk of irreversible loss of coral reefs, tidal marshes, seagrass meadows, plankton community, and other marine and coastal ecosystems increases with global warming, especially at 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise or more. Next would be something that touches the heart of everyone, would be on the health. On the health aspect now, with the climate change that is increasing in terms of the vector-borne and the waterborne diseases, causing diseases, undernutrition, mental disorders, and allergic diseases in Asia. By increasing the hazards such as heat waves, flooding and drought, air pollutants in combination with more exposure and vulnerability. All of this is causing mortality, death related to circulatory, respiratory, diabetic, and infectious disease, as well as infant mortality, that rain and temperature that will increase the risk of diarrheal diseases as well, dengue fever and malaria in tropical and subtropical Asia. More frequent hot days and this intense heat wave will increase heat-related death in Asia as well. So this is also related to our food security, whereby the increase of what is happening, as we have been observing rather frequently of late, the floods and the drought, together with heat stress, will have adverse impacts on our food availability and the prices of our food, resulting in the increased undernourishment, particularly in the South and Southeast Asia. What about our energy sector? As now the Asian countries, we are experiencing a hotter summer climate, resulting in the increase of energy demand for cooling at a rapid rate. So together with our population growth, therefore, among the 13 developing countries with the large energy consumption in Asia, 11 of these developing countries now are exposed to high energy insecurity and industrial system at risk. Okay, moving to our cities and settlement. As we are all moving towards urban area, climate change is now causing losses
due to the damage in terms of infrastructure, disruption in services, and affected supply chains in Asia. And this would increase to this infrastructure as well as would provide opportunities to invest in climate resilient infrastructure as well as in providing more green job provision. The next figure that I will show to you indicates the key risks and adaptation option in selected cities across Asia. As you can see from Central Asia, North Asia, West, South, Southeast, and South and East Asia, you see that those key risks identified in this figure, floods, sea level rise, heat, urban, extreme rain, drought, cyclone, permafrost, and others. These are being indicated by the purple circles and blue, indicating the risk level as well as the evidence that you can see and how the progress and the evidence that is provided. So as you can see for Kuala Lumpur, where we are now, we see that there's a lot of floods, and that is indicating by the risk evidence of that purple color circle in terms of high evidence of that. All right. So finally, on the issues of migration, although it's not much discussed, particularly for Malaysia, but for Asia, there is high evidence, medium agreement in terms of this increased climate variability and the extreme events that are already driving migration, and projecting this longer term climate change would increase these migration flows across Asia. So even though we have this methodological disagreement on this detection and attribution of migration due to climate change, we understand that this higher warning and associated changes in frequency and intensity on the slow onset events, such as drought and sea level, and as also on the rapid onset events such as cyclones and flooding, would increase this involuntary displacement in the future, especially under the SSP3 and SSP4 pathways, particularly for countries like Bangladesh, China, India, and Philippines, which have recorded more than 4 million disaster-induced displacement, therefore making Southeast Asia and East Asia that would trigger the internal displacement of 9.6 million people in the last 2019, which contributed towards 30% of the total global displacement. And finally, how can we cope with this? Understanding this risk of climate change is through this adaptation option and barriers. We would like to see that, or we understand now that the significant barriers to climate resilient development are observed from the fragmented and reactive governance, inadequate evidence of which action to prioritize, and how can we sequence them, and also finance deficit. Some of these Asian countries and regions have offered solutions to overcome these barriers through advanced technologies, such as in-situ observation and remote sensing, and a variety of new sensor technology, citizen science and artificial intelligence, and also by increasing regional partnerships and learning to improve forecasting capabilities and better risk awareness. And in terms of this adaptation option for climate smart agriculture, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and to invest in urban blue-green infrastructure in order for us to meet adaptation as well as mitigation towards achieving sustainable development goals simultaneously. And these, all in all, the option is actually to present the opportunities for climate resilient development pathways in Asia, hopefully by addressing all of these climate risk, vulnerability, and adaptation measures, all to be factored into decision-making across all levels of governance. So with that, thank you for listening to me, and I'll pass this to Professor Joy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharina, for that overview of Asia. Now, I will move on to some highlights on adaptation and mitigation to reinforce the message we are getting from which my colleagues have presented. But I'll start off with new findings from the Working Group 1 on short-lived climate forces, which are substances with relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide. And these include methane, ozone, and aerosols, such as black carbon and PM 2.5. So the new finding is that over the 10 to 20 years time scale, the influence of these short-lived climate forces is at least as large as that of carbon dioxide. So therefore, to limit global warming, strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. Now, this would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but also improve air quality. So reducing short-lived climate forces is actually a no-regret option for improving air quality, which immediately and directly benefits all of us with respect to our health and well-being in cities. Another aspect that Dr. Zelina already alluded to is the increasing urgency for worldwide action. And in Working Group 2, we present climate resilience development, which is essentially a process for implementing mitigation and adaptation together in support of sustainable development for all. And in this aspect, accelerating adaptation is very important. You need, of course, political will, institutional frameworks must be right. We need enhancing knowledge of impacts and risks to improve responses. And this has to come in continuously and regularly. And we need monitoring and evaluation. And we need inclusive governance that prioritizes equity and justice and direct participation. Okay, that notwithstanding this, the report indicates that we have limits to adaptation. Yeah, so even effective adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages. Above 1.5 degrees, natural solutions, some of them may no longer work, and people living on small islands, such as islands around Malaysia and Indonesia, we may run into issues that relate to freshwater availability, and beyond 2 degrees, the farming of multiple staple crops will be very challenging. Thus, it is essential that we make rapid, deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to keep the maximum number of adaptation options open. Okay. Now, climate resilient development is essentially the solutions framework that we are presenting from Working Group 2 and to be considered across government and all of civil society. It requires partnership. It draws on wide-ranging knowledge, not just scientific knowledge, but also indigenous, local, practical knowledge as well. There is emphasis on restoring ecosystems, involving marginalized group and prioritizing equity and justice and different interests, values, and worldviews. And this requires scaled up investment and international cooperation. However, the prospects for climate resilient development will become further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius and may not be possible at all if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. So our colleagues from the Working Group 3 in their 6th assessment report shared their findings indicate that the annual greenhouse gas emission is the highest level in human history over the period of 2010 and 2019. But there is increased evidence of climate action, which is very positive. However, unless there are immediate and deep emission reduction across all sectors, 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach, and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires that global warming and greenhouse gas emissions peak in the next 2 years. before 2025, and that they are reduced by 43% by 2030. So these are the new numbers that are coming out from science. And we also need methane to be reduced by 34 degrees by 2030. Now, if you think this is impossible, the science says that there are options available now in every sector that can at least halve emissions by 2030. And these sectors include the demand and services, energy, land use, industry, urban buildings, and transport sector. So we will be sharing with you the summary for policymakers at the end of this session, so you can see what these options are for yourself. And the findings of Working Group 3 indicates that regulatory and economic instruments have already proven to be effective in reducing emissions. So you just need to ratchet it up, and investment and policies are required that push forward low emission technological innovation. Now, the financial flows at the moment is about 3 to 6 times lower than the levels needed by 2030 to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees for that matter. But the point is that there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close investment gaps. And of course, the challenge of closing gaps is widest for developing countries. So the evidence is clear, ladies and gentlemen. The time for action is now. Thank you very much for your attention from me and my colleagues in the IPCC. The platform is now yours, Datin Sri.
Thank you, Prof.Joy. Thank you so much. This was a brilliant overview from global to regional levels. Thank you, Prof.Joy, Dr. Zelina, Dr. Sharina. So for anyone in the audience, if you have any questions, clarifications on the presentation, please post it on the Q&A box so that the authors can respond to you. I'm not sure if we'll have time, so it's better that you just put it into the Q&A box first. And we also welcome your thoughts on issues of priority and the way forward. Now, we are now going to move on to take some reflections and suggestions from our panelists. I'd like to invite Professor Fredolin Panggang, a fellow of the Academy of Sciences and academic at University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He is the former vice chair of IPCC Working Group 1 during the 5th assessment cycle. His intervention will be on downscaling climate projections. Prof. Fredolin.
Thank you, Datin. I was told I have only 2 minutes for this. I would like to highlight 2 important things. First, perhaps I reiterate here that the science, the evidence that points to the fact that climate change is indeed changing is robust and clear. Perhaps the participant can refer to the policy for summary maker of the Working Group 1 of the IPCC. The point number 2 that I would like to mention here, that we need to steer the country towards climate resilient development pathways. For that, I think we need to focus on both adaptation and mitigation. And I think we need to do more research in assessing the risk of climate change impact on critical sectors by combining information on robust climate projection that we mentioned about climate projection as well, vulnerability and exposure, in order to formulate adaptation measures and minimize the risk. So speaking about climate projection, this is one area that I have been involved very much in the Southeast Asia region through Codex Southeast Asia, where we perform climate simulation over this region. And we found out that in the future, if the world fails to mitigate climate change, we will be expecting intensification of both dry and wet extremes, and there will be more impact as we as the world become warmer and warmer. For your information, that the models simulation of this Cordex Southeast Asia have also been used by the IPCC in constructing the IPCC atlas that perhaps I think in the this has been highlighted by the panels before. So we need to formulate policies, perhaps even law, that can steer the country towards climate resilient development pathways that can be applied at every level of government, local, state, and federal. So I think it's time for us to take action, and hopefully we can minimize the impact of climate change, as now we are not quite sure if we can even limit the warming at 1.5 or 2 degrees. Thank you, Datin.
Thank you so much, Prof. Redelin. Now, it gives me great pleasure to invite Prof. Muhammad Talib Latif, a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences and academic at University Kebangsaan Malaysia. He is a member of the IPCC expert meeting on short-lived climate forces. He will share his views on short-lived climate forces and air pollution. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Datin, Yang Bahagia Tan Sri, Datuk SM Fellow, and all participants. I want to share about short-lived climate forces. I think from 2017, IPCC has initiated a discussion on short-lived climate forces. And based on the plan, they want to continue to have a report from 2023. So I have involved with discussion on short-lived climate forces. Last meeting in April 11 to 14 this year. And based on the information, actually short-lived climate forces actually is air pollution with relatively short lifetime in the atmosphere compared with CO2. So these short-lived climate forces or SLCF actually pollutant that also can influence climate and also can affect the human health. So far, IPCC has categorized several pollutants as SLCF, which are black carbon, BC, organic carbon, PM 2.5, oxide of nitrogen or NOx, carbon monoxide, non-methane volatile organic compound, including biological volatile organic compounds such as isoprene, sulfur dioxide, and ammonia. So based on this meeting, actually, the IPCC has discussed about the gap on how a different country can produce a report on these short-lived climate forces based on the parameters that I mentioned before. So for Malaysia, I think we don't have a problem to determine several of these air pollutants. For example, we have a very good monitoring station that monitor PM 2.5, NOx, CO, and also non-methane volatile organic compound. We need to determine, for example, black carbon and organic carbon in particulate matter. For the time being, we determine PM 2.5. So I think for our country, we need to be ready to provide data on this inventory of SLCF for us to comply the inventory that need for IPCC report in the future. Thank you very much, Datin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof. Muhammad Talib Latif. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Salma Zakaria, a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences, a former lead author of the IPCC Special Report in the 5th Assessment Cycle. Dr. Salma has also served UN ESCAP and will share her views on water resources. Over to you, Dr. Salma.
Thank you, Datin, Sunita. I think it was quite clear just now that the report is rather generic and not really focused on our country. That's one area in which I think the scientific community can expand on some details that will be needed. Because climate impact assessment analysis and adaptation, although it relies heavily on scientific knowledge, the science and technology of the implementation of the governance of the adaptation of the impact has to be holistic and have policy coherence. While utilizing the climate scientific knowledge, it has to include knowledge of land use, the country's capacity, availability of data and information, and consequently the cost needed for targeted objectives for protection. We, at the moment, I think we don't, not that I know of, have specific target that need to be, prioritized and move forward. So that's one thing that we have to come up, and that means we need, as has been highlighted by the presenters, we need the whole country in a whole ecosystem perspective, which means also the whole country has to be working together. Essentially, it's an end-to-end approach for adaptation from science to technology and then to the governance side, meaning that those who are the decision makers themselves has to be well aware what is the impact we are, what we can be looking at even from now. And of course, when you look at IPCC, having been in IPCC AR3, assessment report number 3, the focus is always on bigger areas where it can be, can cover a wider range. But when it comes to Malaysia, ours is a maritime region, and I think the impact of sea level rise will be felt, and there are already information. Probably it has not been written and into publication that can be used by IPCC. That needs to be done also. But I think we don't really have time to lose. Thank you, Datin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Salma. Now it gives me great pleasure to invite Dato' Rahim Nik, a fellow of the Academy of Sciences. Dato' Rahim was instrumental in setting up the initial GHG inventory for the country and the inaugural declaration of Malaysia's 40% carbon intensity reduction at COP15 in Copenhagen. He will share his thoughts on biodiversity and forests. Over to you.
Thank you, Datin Moderator and all the colleagues. I have 2 points here. First, as mentioned by Prof.Joy, there are options available for us to reduce our GHG emission, even in Malaysia. Because in that aspect, as mentioned by the report, the forest sector plays an important role in providing sink or removal of about 1/3 of anthropogenic GHG. So in this aspect, AFULU, or the term use, agriculture, forestry, and land use, offers significant mitigation potential at relatively low cost and can provide up to 20–30% of global mitigation needed for us to achieve 1.5 pathway. So this is an important aspect because many countries now are increased to achieve net zero emission by a certain date, even Malaysia, as much promised by Minister. So for Malaysia, we are very fortunate that our forests, that we have 55%, 55.3%, based on the latest BUR, biannual report, that our forests can absorb up to 77% of GHG based on the latest BUR. So this is good advantage for us to use our mitigation potential later on. But of course, from now onward, we have to restore, maintain our forests so that it serves this purpose in future, and also for our net zero carbon emission strategy later on. Secondly, I want to touch on the importance of interconnection or interaction mentioned by Dr. Zelina just now. IPCC report underscored the importance of this understanding of the interaction, because in formulating our adaptation strategy later on, we make sure that all these interaction strategies are included in the strategy, because it provides essentially the core benefits to the system or positive outcome. For example, I give if say we want to restore our forests, degraded forests, first we got benefit in terms of positive outcome in terms of biodiversity enrichment. Then we also have increased carbon storage and also has value to the local community. Therefore, it's very important for us to understand the interconnection or interaction between forest ecosystem and also climate system, so that all these co-benefits can be achieved, not co-detrimental. That's what another term used, so that we can have maximum optimum benefit from this adaptation strategy later on. So of course, we have to link this to the current SDGs, because we don't want to have overlaps into a strategy later on, so that we are the country in concert working towards achieving the target in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. And now I would like to invite Professor Dato' Aileen Tan Shawai, a Fellow of the Academy of Science and an academic at University Science Malaysia. She will share her perspective on oceans and marine biodiversity. Dr. Aileen.
Yeah, thank you, Datin, Seri, Sunita. It's a great pleasure to be given an opportunity to speak here. Well, the effort by the IPCC working groups provides a framework on a larger scale and is based on our cumulative research experience is commendable. The predicted impact of climate change on the local and regional scale and their consequences needs to be ascertained for several important reasons, such as, number one, the importance of the region as the richest marine biodiversity nexus, not only for the region, but for the planet, including the marine areas of the Coral Triangle, where Malaysia is right in the middle. The second is the expected impact of temperature rise, which is above the global expected average here. And third, the increased climate risk to both the natural and human ecosystems, with the key areas residing close to or on the coastal areas, where actually a high percentage of population residing near the coast. And then fourth, the associated anthropogenic influence that, together with the impact of climate change, will actually shape our future, especially like what Prof. Salma has mentioned, especially Malaysia being a maritime nation. The slow pace of climate change research, especially in the field of marine and coastal sciences, a lot have been talked, mostly focusing on the terrestrial area, but very minimum is focused on the ocean and the coastal areas, despite the ocean is covering 70% of the planet. And the slow pace of climate change research in the field of marine and coastal sciences that impede our understanding of processes and changes on the local scenarios is actually impacting not only our environment, but also on our food security. There will be a need to translate these findings to the various sectors and support the growing concerns of the nation. Well, public understanding and community support are key to successfully negotiate the climate risk. We have to be in line with the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences, which is supporting the SDGs as well. Well, climate change mitigation in a developing country like Malaysia places an extra burden to finding the optimum solutions to risk reduction. Oftentimes, the combination of the multitude of impacts and their repercussions seem overwhelming. Well, the idea of that climate change risk can be overcome is vital, and the mitigation and risk is more manageable when accepted and shared by society's stewards. So I guess we should recommend the engagement of climate change communities with the education sector of the nation. If the current generation of school children are to engage effectively with the evolving scenarios that we envisage, clearly climate education is central. So this should be a major part of our syllabus. Yeah, thank you. Back to you, Datin Seri. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dato' Eileen. Definitely climate education is something that I feel very strongly about as well. Now, I'm going to shortly call on the panelists to address some of the questions in the box, and also for Dr. Joy to comment on the interventions that have been made. But before that, just a few minutes, because I noticed a question on climate governance, which is, of course, you know, what I am involved in. I'm the co-founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, which is the country chapter of a World Economic Forum initiative. And this initiative is to advocate to boards of directors so that directors are much more climate literate about the challenges that are being faced. And businesses are not just large emitters, but there's also tremendous potential for businesses to take climate action and to lead in thought leadership as well. So globally, we're seeing that businesses are under unprecedented pressure from investors, from regulators, the financiers, customers, and staff to demonstrate climate resilience against a backdrop of a warming world. And they need to articulate their climate ambition to demonstrate their ability to transition in support of goals agreed to at 2015 in Paris. So industry needs to have a high level of confidence in national ambition. And it's good to have the involvement of private sector and industries where it's critical to solve these issues. And so Climate Governance Malaysia, in close cooperation with the CEO Action Network, has organized for a series of roundtable sessions to discuss these problems and to try and crowdsource for solutions. And of course, all of this needs an urgent alignment of policy, economic policies, climate and energy priorities against a backdrop of socioeconomic well-being as well. Because when government policy is explicit and relatively predictable, then we can rely on the private sector to act accordingly. So this is what climate governance is really about. Every segment of our society and economy will need to step up to meet the very real risks that we have heard about, but also the opportunities which are bound to arise. And so this is why these sort of conversations are critical in facilitating that. So now if I can invite Prof.Joy to comment on the interventions, please.
Thank you, Datin Sunita. So so far, based on the intervention, I would like my colleagues also to come on because they have been responding to some of the questions that came on chat. And I think I would like to thank all our panelists, our really high caliber panelists. I totally agree that there is need for policy tools to just go from beyond being at federal level, where the capacity is the highest, to get into the state and local levels as well. So I think one of the things we should do as a strategy from the perhaps all of us in our various institutions is to move towards building capacity at the local level, the PBT level, to look at how we can support them, those of us who are knowledge generators. And that's an important point to take away. And I am glad to learn that we have good monitoring systems and that while there are gaps identified, I think we have a great early start, as my colleague Prof. Talib has mentioned, to start on these needs to fill the gap and start the system to be in place for addressing short-lived climate forces. And if we address this in cities, it is indeed a no-regret option, nothing bold about it. It's factual. What is a no-regret option? It is an action that not only benefits emission reduction, but more importantly, the action itself benefits us immediately and directly. All of us, our children, are living in polluted cities. That's a fact. That's evidence-based. And that's a problem for Southeast Asia. So there are many studies already out that if we handle our air pollution, not only will we get a direct health benefit, but we will also be getting contributing to emission reduction. So that is a no-brainer, nothing courageous about it, nothing bold about it. It's a fact of life. It benefits us immediately. So I will now pass in terms of, before I move on, I think that's great that the emphasis from all our panelists, from Dr. Salma, Prof. Fredeline, before her, was all on the need for the local scale information and research, so that we can build our own scenarios on what is the potential impact. And even Dr. Rahim was saying, we need to look at forests as a no-regret option itself, where we restore and maintain forests. We maintain it for ourselves in a way and our local community, but there is a climate service, and hence the importance on interactions that Dr. Rahim Nick has emphasized is critical. And I really thank Prof. Dr. Eileen Tan for highlighting this missing component in Malaysia. We always forget the oceans and the marine ecosystems, and she has very nicely articulated about the cascading effect that this missing link provides. This missing link is going to create a cascading impact not only to the environment, but to our food production sector. And I really echo her call for partnerships and engagement, not only in building awareness, but in all the different agencies working together so that we can all collectively do work to bring in more scientific knowledge for not only decision making, but it will also benefit all the communities at the local level, and also the other aspects such as contributing to the climate needs as well. So I pass over to Dr. Zelina to actually to complement me and highlight other aspects that I may have missed. Platform is yours, Dr. Zelina.
Thank you very much, Prof.Joy. Yeah, I think it's very important to take actions which can have co-benefits, as Prof.Joy said, in the no regret option. And there have been quite a number of analysis and results presented in the report where certain types of actions do have co-benefits, and Prof. Fredeline also mentioned about this, and also Dr. Rahim Nick also about how we can complement with the sustainability indicators. And also we need to do this at the local level. And yes, the IPCC report is at the global level, so it's very difficult for them, to actually focus down. And it can be a very sensitive issue because they are based, the report is based on published work and published and refereed work. So there may be actions being taken, internal reports. There are a lot in Malaysia. We have a lot of internal reports of confidential, security embargo on it, and we are taking action. But this doesn't make it into the published literature. We have done a lot of studies which many people present in many of our research institutions, but they are still published. They are presented online or published online as PowerPoint presentations, but not published paper. So there are works which we are doing. Unfortunately, we have been slow or a little bit behind in maybe publicizing the work which we do. And I think we hope that this presentation to ASM will also be an encouragement for people to do more work, and we can identify where the gaps are. Some of the gaps have been identified by the panelists, and to publish, and for the next cycle. And as I mentioned, also for certain areas like small islands, especially developing regions, there is a lack of certain types of studies. And there's also a lack of integrating the results of some of the studies with impacts to society. So I think this combination of the physical impacts and what are the economic and societal effects to society, that's something which is a big area, which I think we can do a lot of work with in Malaysia. And I think with that, I'll pass you on to Dr. Sharina, who's correctly placed in that field. Thank you. Sharina, I think you're muted.
Sorry, actually, there's a heavy thunderstorm over here, actually, but I hope you can hear me well. Thank you to Dr. Zelina and Prof.Joy. I concur to my colleagues, and I'd just like to sort of emphasize further on the importance of addressing this issue of climate change, not only at the level of policymakers, all levels, private sectors, NGO, civil society. And so I like to address that also by answering to one question by Q Jia Yao, particularly what can we do in addressing this climate change and building partnerships towards climate resilient development. I think that is very important, and in fact we highlighted in the Chapter 10 IPCC report on this forging partnership, and also prioritizing the importance of enhancing capabilities at all levels, because we understand that we have differentiated vulnerabilities, and these differentiated vulnerabilities need to be addressed by enhancing capabilities at all levels for us to come collectively to address these impacts of climate change, be it from the physical, from the social, from the cultural, even from the religious aspect, particularly as what Dr. Zelina had mentioned in having the enough data to work on. And data is available, but it's just in terms of the outreach of how we can utilize this available data and document at all levels, because it also depends on the capability of the users for this data. So that information sharing, the sectoral interaction, and mainstreaming of science, social science, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, to identify the critical issues of climate thresholds across all sectors, across different areas, would be something that we really need to work on. So on the high note, I know there's a lot of when we talk about impacts of climate change and what can we do, there's a lot of kind of like stress out there, but I think we need to also have hope, and acknowledging that there are new concepts of decentralization and how to further empower self-reliant society. Like in Chapter 10 in the IPCC Working Group 2 report, we talk about the concept of circulating an ecological sphere as part of the emerging concept to integrate this kind of adaptive governance. So, that is kind of like the theoretical talk, but also I think this is something that we can translate something into action, and something that we can produce a good solution for all in addressing these impacts of climate change and other sustainable development issues as well. So thank you for that, Prof.Joy. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Zelina and Dr. Fasha. And if I may just carry on to just emphasize that when we do these local level studies, we need to understand that every adaptation solution is context specific and area specific. Yeah, therefore, whether there will not be a generic solution. For example, is groundwater generally, should you retain or should you extract? So it all depends on the context and the area. Similarly, in the maritime, the coral areas, how do you deal with that? So the context and the area is very specific. And although global warming is going to cross 1.5 degrees, the spatial impacts and the risks are different. Temperate countries have a higher capacity to withstand that level of warming compared to tropical regions. And that's something we need to take note of. And what is the role of ASM in this context? From our side, we are already starting this. This is the first event where we are trying to mobilize scientific leadership and partnerships. And what does that entail? The first thing is to building trust between the different types of disciplines that are involved. The solution to climate change is in the social sphere, although the physical sciences have been bringing this to the attention of the world. And building trust between the different disciplines is very important, and being honest brokers, that's critical. And this is something scientists can do, from ASM can do, and also more importantly, providing evidence based on science. And another aspect we can do is to advocate for open sharing of science information in this country, so that we can all at every level and every partner, not only in academia, but also in the civil society and private sector, can conduct your own investigations beyond what is available to you at the moment right now. So these are important aspects to be taken into account. And I just want, before I pass the floor to Datin Sunita, I just want to caution about the issue of carbon credit and carbon transfer. What we need now in the world is absolute carbon and GHG emission reduction, yeah, not transfer of the reduction from country A to country B. So we really, we need to advocate, especially the private sector. At the end of the day, if there is chaos, it's the private sector that cannot make the money and cannot proceed. At the end of the day, private sector, civil society, and government and community, we all have the same goal. Let's not forget that the same goal is where we all live in harmony and in safety, with every opportunity to have a decent livelihoods. So with that, I return the platform to our moderator, Datin Sunita.
Thank you so much, Prof.Joy. I think this has been such an insightful session. We have a few questions in the Q&A box. I wonder if any of our speakers would like to address any of this live. Otherwise, of course, we could always respond in writing, because it seems like we have an extremely thoughtful audience. And I wonder if anyone would like to respond to the questions.
Actually, I have responded on the groundwater in terms of the need for the context and area-specific information, on the carbon credit and cautioning on the need for absolute carbon reduction. Yeah, and on the role of ASM, that has been responded to. Perhaps Dr. Zelina, you would want to come in on aspects that you have covered.
Yeah, I have answered a couple. I mean, in the process of answering some, some are quite general, I think, and there are some, like say, okay, going from the most recent one, I think Robert Chung asked about underground water. Oh, that's to Prof.Joy. Okay, hard corals are living at 1 degree lower than their upper thermal limits, and coral reefs will be the first to be significantly affected. Yes, that is correct. What is our crucial first step to mitigate this at the government or local island level? Well, it's very difficult because the corals are living in an environment which is partly outside of our control, and assessments being made for example, for the Great Barrier Reef already place the Great Barrier Reef corals at very high risk because they're seeing mass mortalities. So even if you do, for example, transplanting or replanting, if the surrounding waters are going to still increase in temperatures, that would be very difficult. Of course, we can do mapping to identify areas where colder water streams are rising. But we're also anticipating there might be changes in how the flow of ocean currents might be occurring, probably by already some are being seen now. So that's a lot of effort, I think, and research would need to be done. So I think, you know, we have a big task for people who are studying coral reefs, and as well as for the fisheries, because a lot of our fishes also very close to their upper limit, thermal upper limit. The only good news I would say is that when we're talking about 1.5 degree rise globally, for Southeast Asia, that temperature rise is expected to be a bit lower than the global level, partly because we are surrounded by oceans, which provide a ameliorating effect onto the temperatures. However, I think even in the recent temperatures that we are seeing in Kuala Lumpur or in other parts of the country, we are coming very close to what we would say would be very uncomfortable for general population. So I think that is, unfortunately, that is now at a temperature of 1.2 degrees centigrade for this year. So we could only imagine what would happen with an increase up to 1.5 degrees centigrade in the next 20 years. And that is only the median level. So there's actually a range within which that temperature increase or warming would occur. So it's really very dire.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zelina. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm glad that the speakers are trying to respond in writing. And maybe when we have a blog post, which is issued in a company, because CGM issues blog posts to cover the events, we can invite all the speakers to respond in writing as well, Dr. Joy. Yeah? So I want to thank the speakers for sharing the latest IPCC findings, and our panelists for sharing their views with us on the way forward. I want to thank the participants for their active inputs. We will have them documented in a report of this event. We now know that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is critical for tropical Southeast Asia, one of the few regions that is projected to be disproportionately affected and to experience the highest losses in that event. Even if we hit 1.5 degrees, which is supposed, the WMO announced this yesterday, that there's a more than 50% chance of hitting 1.5 degrees of warming in the next few years, many human and natural ecological systems are going to face additional severe risks and most probably irreversible changes. So we've heard the stark warning from science. This is an emergency that we are facing that is informed by science. We are not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And we need immediate and deep emissions reductions, absolute emissions reductions across all sectors. This requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 and to be halved by 2030, and methane to be reduced by 34% by 2030. But science also informs us that there are options available in every sector that can help us get to these targets. So we need to triple our actions around technological change, economic instruments, behavioral changes. We need immediate and society-wide transformation to overcome limits to adaptation so that we can build resilience and reduce climate risks to tolerable levels. We need inclusive, equitable, just development to achieve societal goals without leaving anyone behind. Minor, marginal, reactive, or incremental changes will not be sufficient. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a tremendous round of reflections from our esteemed panelists. We've had many comments and many sound suggestions have been put forward. Building on this session, I look forward to continuing close collaboration between Climate Governance Malaysia and Academy of Science Malaysia in providing scientific leadership to accelerate action for climate resilient development, especially by the private sector. Thank you very much for joining us today. I now hand the platform back to our host, Dr. Fasha.
Thank you, Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, for skillfully moderating the event and bringing us to a successful end. The PDF version of the presentation slides can be downloaded now from the chat box. We have also included the summary of policymakers for the IPCC Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports for those who are interested. On behalf of the conveners, the Committee on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, Climate Governance Malaysia, ANS and CIPRI UKM, I thank you for all your support and participation in this event. Goodbye and have a nice evening.